All right, guys, welcome back. We have our next PD. We're going to be talking about, again, COVID-19, but kind of how it impacts PE and health education and what our classrooms and instructional methods education might look like moving forward. We have back again with us Sean Nevels, the main man. Welcome back, Sean. Sean is our go-to for anything COVID related to the COVID-19 project manager for Shape America. About as high up as it gets in PE for COVID-19. So we're glad to have Sean with us to do some more professional development regarding these. At the end of this, Sean and I may do some kind of back and forth discussion, just kind of on some of our individual thoughts on some of this. And I may throw Sean a couple individual questions just to kind of poke his brain and get him going. But without further adu, I'll let Sean get started and we'll get going.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to be on with my man, Zach Wheeler, and Missouri Desi. Once again, Sean Nevels here, CDC COVID-19 Project Director for Shape America. Also the podcast host for the Shape America podcast. So we definitely do a lot of different things on top of professional development, but different ways of professional development, because I know, we're kind of on the second half of the school year. So you may be zoomed out. So, if you catch this on YouTube, please do. And also, if you want to hear more discussions based around what we do, you can follow the Shape America podcast. If you're kind of looking at our start here of our presentation, start us off with a quote, something to get your mind working as we go through this presentation and what we're talking about today. But I always, my favorite overall leader in person I like to model a lot of what I do off of is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the quote there is, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character is the goal of true education. So keep that frame of mind as we go through this presentation. The wrong button there. There we go. So the topic of today, what is the future of physical education and health? And, I got that. This is a pretty cool one I found from physedsuperhero.com. But that is our topic because, hopefully your district, your school has done a good job really kind of managing this pandemic. And let's be honest, whatever you can do as a teacher works. It's fine as long as you're doing it to the best of your abilities, because as Zach and I have said many times through these conversations, is that you're all first-year teachers, all right? And this whole environment and landscape of learning is different. So whatever you're doing, and as long as it's working, you're trying, just keep doing it. Even if it doesn't work, do as we do as reflective practitioners and continue to be better as we move along this. So once again, our topic for today is how will physical education and health education change moving forward? And the main objective for this discussion is to talk about topics and resources to consider as you plan for your health and physical education instruction for the next school year, okay? Because once again, we're thinking past COVID-19. The pandemic will be over soon, though COVID-19, the virus, maybe not necessarily, but past the pandemic is how are we going to evolve our instruction of health and physical education, okay? So before we get into all of that, once again, Shape America is whom I'm employed through, and their virtual conference is coming up Tuesday, April 13th through Saturday, April 17th. It's a virtual conference, so I do advise you to go check it out on the Shape America webpage. Look at the rates, look at the sessions. The sessions are going to be coming out here soon, the end of February, but look at just all the different things that is there to offer and all the professional development, but just not the professional development, the sessions, the engagement sessions, wellness sessions, coffee talks, lunch and learns, amazing things like that. And also one of our guest speakers is Darian Cockrell, all right, Missouri 2021 Teacher of the Year. We're fortunate to have him on. At this point, my Missouri people, if you haven't heard his story, you are way behind. So just make sure you check him out. Really take the time to listen to his story. And just to have him on our national stage is absolutely amazing. So I do want to recognize that it is Black History Month. And, I kind of started you off with that Martin Luther King quote, but it is Black History Month. And one thing we're doing at Shape America to recognize Black History Month is by highlighting some of the activities and resources that are out there from our educators across the community. You'll see it if you follow Shape America on Twitter. Soon we'll have a post with a lot of different resources and activities. Once again, like I said, that came from the community, but that's just kind of the way to highlight Black History Month and what that means for health and physical education in particular. Now, going from that point and kind of getting into our topics, I have three main topics to talk about when it comes to health and physical education moving forward. The first one being culturally responsive teaching. Okay, that is a big loaded topic right now because it's still developing. And a lot of these topics we're talking about are developing topics in our field. But as we close out the 2020-2021 school year, really start to think about these things and how you can start applying that for the next school year to benefit everybody, right? So when we define it, when we're defining culturally responsive teaching, let's look at that very first bullet point there. And that's culturally responsive teachers act on knowledge about cultural differences and implement as habits pedagogical skills that foster a meaningful and relevant education for all learners. Once again, that's really loaded. There's a lot there, and we'll kind of unpack that as we go through this. But the one key thing that I want to highlight in that first bullet is that culturally responsive teachers act. It's not just a matter of having knowledge of cultures and values and ideas, but acting on it, bringing it into practice in the classroom on a regular basis, right? So let's start getting to the habit of acting now and creating these new strategies and practices around culturally responsive teaching, or I'll just say CRT to shorten it up through the conversation. Next one, and what I kind of talked about before, is teachers need a deeper understanding of culture, its impact on schools, and the increasing diverse student population. I had some statistics here in front of me not too long ago, but we're turning into this diverse community in America. Just a whole wealth of racial differences, but we're also talking about differences in values and ideas, right? So, it's time to start really embracing that in our everyday teaching, our everyday learning. And then the third bullet there is teachers must confront their own cultural biases and recognize the value, not the deficits of other cultural backgrounds. A lot of times when we're talking about marginalized populations, first off, just saying that term marginalized means that there's already a deficit when you're talking about your students of color or your communities of color, is that deficit thinking. So let's take that deficit thinking and let's flip that to value it and really value what these different cultures and people have to offer, right? So let's really start to flip our mindset when it comes to CRT and culturally responsive teaching, right? So now breaking that down and putting it into practice kind of one bit at a time here. So culturally responsive teaching, and I took that model there from successful academics, and I'll have kind of some of those resources that we're talking about and addressing here in a bit, some of our citations, right? So just kind of going through that chart there, bringing native language into the classroom, valuing, the spoken language of those students. And it may not necessarily be an ethnic thing, but think about, just kind of the lingos different students use and different cultures use, valuing that and representing it, not trying to change it, but allowing them to be their authentic self, and how, whatever native tongue they use at home, you appreciate that and recognize that within the classroom. Understanding history and culture, not just doing things and playing games, but what's the significance of it? What's the value of it? How did that game or activity even come to our country? Going around their community culture into the classroom. So, from the home to the community, what's happening in the community, what different cultures are valued in the community. Once again, bringing that to the classroom. And then family involvement. A lot, especially in this virtual environment, of what has been so beneficial is that we've been able to, if we're fortunate, virtually reach these families, and families can see what we're doing and how we're promoting our programs, our health and physical education programs. So now using that for the purposes of culturally responsive teaching. So, going to the right there, the bullets of, okay, once again, how does that apply to a physical education classroom? First one is participating in culturally based games and activities. I know dance is one of those big things where we kind of promote that cultural inclusivity, but also what games, what activities can we highlight and promote around that? Next one, offer variety, like individual activities, team oriented games, but allowing also student choice, giving students that chance to first off be individuals, show their individual abilities, show their individual cultures and what they value when it comes to physical activity, because each culture, each identity values physical activity differently. It may not necessarily be our sports based games. Maybe it's just individual activities or just one's own well-being. How do we start to highlight those in our classroom? Team-oriented games, you still want cooperation, right? So let's see these different cultures in your classroom come together and work together. That reflects our society and the society we want to see moving forward. We can be champions in that through collaborative games and team-oriented games. And then student choice. That's just one of those things of advocacy, allowing students to not just participate, but really fully engage and show themselves through this choice and allow them to express themselves through that choice. Provide high expectations with corresponding support. Um, High expectations, right? Once again, going back to that deficit thinking, we want to flip that deficit thinking. Because if we have that deficit mindset, then we keep our expectations for our students low. We want to continue to preach high expectations to our students and their families in our classroom. Um, but then also giving them that support, because we understand that these students are still individuals and they're not all on the same playing field, not on the same level. So how do we give them that support to get them those high expectations? That really speaks to equity, which we'll talk about later in this conversation. And then last, think about your grading. Simple as just grading. Um, we're trying to get away from just, oh, they showed up, they participated, and all of that. Get away from the attendance grading, participation grading. Let's really talk about standards based and skills based grading, grading on that skill competency and fitness performance based on those individual abilities. If you think about those that do fitness testing, hopefully you're doing some form of a pre-test and you're planning your programming around these students' abilities, not just going out there and doing the pacer and giving them a grade. No, it's actually about goal setting, decision making, creating their own exercise plan for themselves. So we'll talk about resources as well. So for culturally responsive teaching, one of the resources we have right now in the Shape America Online Institute is Foundations in Understanding and Building Cultural Proficiency. It's by Culture Links and the founder Huda Essa, who does this whole 3-part series on basically cultural proficiency and cultural humility. Talk about concepts like implicit bias so you can identify yourself, identify what you offer to students and things like that, and just kind of goes down the line of that. If you see at the very bottom, you can actually receive a credit and a half for going through that series. And there's a lot of exercises inside of the webinar series. So you're actually engaging with Huda, the speaker, as you're going through these. So, you're writing things down, you're reflecting. It's a pretty good and very intuitive series. So that's one thing I would check out when we're talking about culturally responsive teaching in our field. So that was topic number 1. Topic number 2, social emotional learning. And that's been a big one, a really, really big one as we've gone even pre-pandemic, but even so much more now during this pandemic, because we're dealing with these new traumas when we close schools and kids don't have that foundation of their lives anymore. Because think about us as adults, work is pretty much a foundation of our day. For students, the physical environment of school is the foundation of their day. So when they don't have that anymore, or it's changed and greatly altered, it could just absolutely change the mental health of a student. So we've talked about that. COVID-19 is one of my former slides. Aside from the physical ramifications for those that may suffer from it, what are some of those mental aspects for those that are dealing with this? The anxiety, fear, grief, panic, and depression, all those things equaling to just long-term trauma. Because think about it, when the pandemic is over and we loosen our way of life again, we kind of go back to that normal that everybody seeks. There's still going to be these more long-term mental effects that we have to deal with, right? The trauma of it all. Okay, so how do we address that in health and physical education? Well, we kind of pull up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And why is that important? Because in order to even get to health and physical education instruction, we have to be able to collectively, not just us as teachers, but the school environment and community, meet these basic needs to get to the point of learning. Students can't learn if they're hungry. Their living arrangements are questionable. Their families may not have their jobs. So that takes all of that, the physiological needs, the needs of safety, and then you start to lose that love and belongingness. So let's think about how can we, as best as we can as teachers and within our instruction, try to meet these needs or give students the skills they need to be resilient in some of these unmet needs, to even get to the actual teaching, the actual physical side of health and physical education, right? So, think of that process to getting to the learning for our students. And to address that, we use the CASEL model for social emotional learning, and the 5 components of it: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision making, and relationship skills. Things that honestly are already embedded in the health and physical education curriculum. And I'll kind of give you a quick thought on that. So the resource we have is the Physical Education SEL Crosswalk that has been around for, I believe, over a year now, but it aligns the health and physical education standards that already exist with these social emotional learning competencies. Just a quick look at what I'm talking about here is, think about standard 2 of physical education. Physically literate individual applies knowledge of concepts, principles, strategies, and tactics related to movement and performance. Well, within that standard, we're already meeting SEL competencies. We're meeting that self-management competency, that responsible decision-making competency, okay? So really start to evolve your thinking of our curriculum and how that actually fits to social emotional learning. It's there. We just have to identify certain pieces and make sure we're really meeting those pieces to meet the overall student, not just the physical abilities, but the mental abilities of students. Then also, that was kind of the standard, the umbrella thought of it when it comes to the standards. But also, then we have activity resources and Health Moves Minds, which has just been an awesome champion program for this social emotional learning movement. For the past few years, has always been a resource there to guide students and to resource teachers to be just new learners, new instruction, new learning through the service learning, right? So actually, if I run through it real quick, taking you to the page just to kind of see what it looks like. And a lot of those activities, as I get to it, are offered when you register. So you have to register first. It's kind of one of the big things: register your school, and there's funding opportunities for your school and also community programs. So, if you're supporting the community or you're partnering with the community, community organization, you can think about that option when it comes to funding. But really, when we get to the education portion of it, lessons, right? Because we all want lessons. We're teachers. We want those tangible things, those things we can use after the conversation, after the meeting, right? So, there's lessons for K through 12, just released high school materials last year. So things you can use in the classroom, mindfulness, activities around equity, diversity, inclusion, which we'll talk about later. Activities around advocacy, how to advocate for oneself, one's own health, and one's own well-being. And then also, because now we're in this virtual teaching environment, right? There's a new virtual resource for all of this. So if you're teaching in that hybrid or virtual learning model, there's a whole packet there to kind of guide you through on how can you use these resources or adapt these resources for the virtual learning environment. So one of the biggest things once again, just one of the biggest programs Shape has to offer when it comes to social emotional learning is Health Moves Minds. So going back here, so the next one, equity, diversity, inclusion. So those are first two. Once again, first was culturally responsive teaching. Second one was social emotional learning. And our third topic for the discussion today is equity, diversity, and inclusion. Not even just EDI work, but social justice, because that, disparities, I've always said, inequities in our society have always existed. But now we've seen, especially during this pandemic, things crossing into social injustices. And now what part do we play in that as health and physical educators to really move ourselves forward in education and not just be a special activity? No, we are essential as health and physical educators, right? We are a part of a well-rounded education. So going through, some of the importance of it all, and it starts with just understanding the social determinants of health, right? And this is CDC resources I'm talking here, CDC information. So you'll see that at the end here when we get there. But housing, that's something that can determine one's health, where you live, your zip code, what you have access to when it comes to healthcare. So, what's around you? Are you in a community that has good facilities, or any facilities for that matter, urgent care, a hospital close by, especially when you're talking about having to transport yourself to some facility, or also parks, recreation, opportunities for recreation just in your own neighborhood. If you're in a certain community that don't have those things, then obviously that can affect your way of life and just not having things around you. Occupation, what you do for a living. Are you making a livable wage? So, especially essential workers, kind of there in the parentheses. Are you in an environment where you're exposed to a lot of people every day? Once again, thinking about essential workers, one of those terms that has just obviously taken over during this pandemic. We're talking about people who are, they're exposed to a great population of people, especially in healthcare and hospitals, dealing with the elderly and sick. And then also for us as teachers, we're dealing with, we work, especially if you're in person, you're around a lot of students every day. You're exposed to a lot of students that come from a whole, different homes. And, what are they exposed to? What can they be bringing in? You think of the term super spreader, as some have defined schools. I wouldn't go as far as to say that. I think that's a little bit much, but we're just exposed to a lot of different people, a lot of different young people in a given day. Income and wealth gaps. We talk about that enough. How much you make. Once again, going back to the access portion of it. If you're not making a livable wage, then obviously that can affect your housing. It can affect your ability to afford essential things like affordable health care, like, certain foods. You think about places being termed as food deserts. Even if you have a grocery store, can you afford some of the quality products, the fresh fruits and things like that? So the wealth gap can obviously determine that as well. The gap in education. Education is the foundation of one's learning. So understanding, knowing the knowledge of what a healthy lifestyle is, the knowledge of, where do I go if I feel sick, or just understanding that I need to go somewhere because I don't feel right. So knowledge is a big thing when it comes to one's health. And then one big one that CDC does recognize, that, going back to the beginning of this, the social justice part of it is discrimination. And that is defined through the CDC as, it exists in our societies, once again, meant to protect well-being of health. Examples of such systems include healthcare, housing, education, criminal justice, finance, But discrimination, which includes racism, can lead to chronic and toxic stress and shape social and economic factors that put some people from racial and ethnic minority groups at risk for COVID-19. And once again, let's cross out COVID-19 and let's really just think about things in general. And yes, teachers are essential. I'm looking at it now. But let's cross out the COVID-19 and let's think about the future. Because once again, the pandemic's going to end, but there's going to be disparities there. Even more so, disparities are going to be exacerbated when we get out of the pandemic of this. And think about just other health risks that people have already gone through. Certain minority groups that, are at risk for or higher risk for diabetes, hypertension, things like that. So yes, all of that. So going back to us, how do we play a role in making that better? Well, it starts with understanding that health and physical education, I always go back to this because this is the basis of what I do, is the foundation of a well-rounded child, right? It is the foundation of learning. Health and physical education is the foundation of one's well-being, okay? We are essential when it comes to developing the well-being of students. Our instruction matters, right? So let's take it there. And then let's go there and let's look at our state. How does our state recognize equity in what we do? And, Missouri and DESE has it defined as educational equity exists when an intentional focus on learning outcomes and the allocation of resources ensures that each student, particularly those from historically underrepresented, underserved, and marginalized groups, excel through purposeful engagement, rigorous instruction, and relevant educational experiences. So, take all we just talked about, those social determinants, put them in the landscape of this bucket of educational equity, and then you have the work that we do, right? So what does that mean? Well, I kind of dive into that here from the resource here, the A to Z of Social Justice, Physical Education, Part 1 from Lynch, Sutherland, and Walton Facette. And then the 5 top tips for a socially just physical education program. Okay, first one being, know your students. Okay, who are they? What do they bring to the table? Going back to the earlier part when we were talking about culturally responsive teaching, is what are their ideas, their values? What is their culture? Okay, take the time to understand their biographies and how they identify. It's not just a racial thing. We're talking about our LGBTQ plus community. Do they identify as he, him, his, or do they identify as her, hers, hers, and I just missed it there. Help me, Zach, if you can on that one. But then also if they just identify as they, non-binary, right? 2, provide opportunities for ownership. Going back to that part of student choice, allow students to be the creators of the curriculum. There's only so much talking as teachers we can do. Eventually we have to allow them to take ownership into the classroom, right? And be their own creators of the curriculum. And really that just maximize the engagement for everybody. That it's not just one person that can lead, that everybody can be a leader and take part in their learning. Allow students to create class expectations at the beginning of the school year, ensure they hold each other accountable. So, once again, that obviously ties into number 2, is that they are a part of this of creating expectations, that it's just not one person that rules all, that they can be a part and really take part in their learning through creation of expectations and being a part of that curriculum, and then holding each other accountable. If they're a part of it, then they take that ownership and then they can hold each other accountable, hopefully in a proper way, right? 4, practice democratic principles, implement monthly class meetings where students can evaluate the class. So if they take that ownership in it, be accountable for it, then they can evaluate it. How's it going? What's working? What's not working? Kind of like we do as teachers, bring them into that process so they understand that. And that going back to our Martin Luther King quote, that gives them the critical thinking skills they need, not just for your classroom, but for their own lives when they graduate. Then move away from an authoritative figure to a facilitator of the classroom. So you've done this implementing and giving them that ownership. So now as a teacher, you can step away. You don't have to be that figure of authority. You can be a facilitator now and just watch it. And that's probably, in my own personal classroom teaching, that was the best time I always had, was to just watch my students do them, right? Take control of the classroom, and I can just sit back and I can be a student. I can be involved in the game. Um, it's fun for everybody. They see that I'm not just this teacher, some figure of authority, but I'm also a human just like them. I can have fun just like them. That's kind of one of those whys why I like physical education. It's because I can be a kid too. So some other resources, kind of gave you that one, which you'll see at the end here. But we talked about the physical education crosswalk when it came to social emotional learning. Well, we have the health education crosswalk, which just released in part of 2020, that has those core competencies as well, but also has that added part. I'll scroll there, equity. Oh my goodness, equity, right? What we kind of talked about. Teacher can focus on these equity outcomes while they're aligning. So we're addressing SEL and we're addressing equity in our teaching. We can become better teachers through all of that. So, using those standards again through health education, particularly, is how do you address equity? How do you affirm diverse cultures? How do you value them? And how that represents your communities and your schools. Also, we're talking about inclusion, roadmap to adaptive physical education. That was also released at the end of 2020. And that's an all, funny to say, all inclusive resource of adaptive physical education. And we're not talking about just instruction. We're talking about the legal aspects of it. When you're talking about students on an individualized education plan, or that have 504s, and it's not just that self-contained adaptive physical education class. We're talking about students that just are in regular physical education that require certain accommodations and resources to be successful in the classroom. So if honestly, that's a course for any physical educator, whether you're a current physical educator or you're a future professional, but anybody and everybody can benefit from that. I would almost say, when you start off your year, that's for sure a go-to. A lot of work was put into it, and I went through it myself, and I can't tell you, my background, my first year of teaching, full-time teaching, was adaptive physical education. And I learned a lot just going through that. I wish I had it when I was still in the classroom. And then some webinars that we recently offered, one for strategies for heat and PEAT programs, because we always want to make sure we're representing higher ed. And then ideas for equitable and accessible teaching. So going back to that equity, what does that mean for virtual learning environments, in-person, hybrid, all that good stuff? And how can we address the issue of access during this time? Then also, we already went through that one. But then the webinar, because this is a continued conversation, it's one of those evolving topics. It does not start and end after in this conversation. It continues after. So a series we launched that's on the Shape America Online Institute as well is Critical Conversations on Trauma-Informed Health and Physical Education. It's a 4-part series. The first part was preparing the next generation of health and physical educators through trauma-informed programs. So we're talking about our HEAT and PEAT, our higher education programs, and how can we get those future professionals prepared for the world that's ahead. That's in their classroom, this diverse population, but also making sure that they have skills of being trauma informed, trauma invested, for sure, is a term that was thrown out through this program. Number 2, responding to trauma in and through physical education. So what does it look like in K-12 physical education? Part 3, trauma sensitive practices in health education. We're talking about skills-based health. What are some aspects of trauma sensitivity that we can, what are some strategies? What are things we need to know about trauma sensitivity going into the classroom and supporting students as they learn about themselves through our health education program? And then last, the one that's coming up Tuesday, February 23rd, at 4:00 p.m. is restorative practices in health and physical education, shifting the norm from punitive to reparative. And once again, that's really the big aspect of talking about social justice, is retooling our brains, is getting away from that deficit way of thinking when we're talking about cultures and marginalized, underrepresented groups, and understanding that those students, those communities, and those populations actually offer value to what we do, not just in our classrooms, but in our society. So kind of wrapping up here, there's always this bank of resources in the COVID-19 resources library on the Shape America page. webpage. Always updating, always adding more. A lot of those things I talked about, some of those webinars and those series are on there if you're needing just a quick way to get to it, aside from all these links I can share with you right now. So that's a way of getting to it. And then also thinking about the next school year, a tool to be looking out for is a Kaiser through Kaiser Permanente and our collaboration with Kaiser Permanente and planning for the next normal, keeping students, staff, teachers, families safe and healthy. This version was version 2 that came out in October of 2020. There's going to be another version in the spring, and that really is going to focus us towards 21-22. I wish I had all the answers for you right now, but as we know, COVID-19 is just an evolving thing. It's new for everybody, and every day the news can be different, right? So especially in this process that we are now, the beginning part of 2021 with the vaccination, what does that mean? And just all these things. So be looking out in the spring for the next version of the Kaiser Permanente playbook for the next school year. And this is kind of goes back to version 2 and what was there and kind of some of the strategies and a checklist for your physical education program, understanding your instruction, making the accommodations necessary, always providing professional development, offering physical activity opportunities like recess, in person and virtual. I know people think about virtual physical activity. Well, you can do it in the classroom. You can implement it in, you're in between a math course, or also creating virtual clubs. Then also, that goes to the very end of it as well, offering the physical activity. So 4 and 5 there. So all this stuff, a lot of this information we kind of talked about kind of through these resources here. Practically cultural responsive pedagogy in physical education, successful academics, CDC resources, one of the big things I'm on, right? Health equity considerations for our ethnic and racial minority groups, our DESE webpage, which talks about and really defines equity when it comes to the state of Missouri. And once again, the A to Z of social justice part 1 and part 2 is also available on the Shape America webpage. So with that, you can always feel free to reach me. You can follow me at Twitter at Coach Nevels, or just email me if you have any questions about the work that we do.
Awesome, man. That was great as always. One thing I like about our webinars, and I think the best reason for me attending, is just to learn everything. Every single time I join, I learn something else from one of our great speakers. So Sean, in my true fashion, I like to end some of these with implementation or individual questions, probing thoughts. I'm going to poke your brain about stuff. And first one, as per usual, I will give my response first because I don't like putting people on the spot and just make, I don't like pop quizzes. So one thing that I wanted to touch on was culturally responsive teaching. And it's something that I think that some teachers have trouble focusing on, have trouble finding spots in some of their curriculums and their scope and sequence for. And I wanted to ask you, if you could give an example of something that you've done in the classroom, as an educator to improve, being culturally responsive, whether it be changing a lesson, and like I said, I'll go first because I don't want to put people on the spot. I am a very fortunate educator to where I've worked in an international school where our school, from the tradition of the school, we housed over 40 countries in our history of teachers or students from all over the world. And a lot of educators would see that as a very daunting task, that can be difficult it's a melting pot of all these kids with different cultural backgrounds, and it's a learning process. But and I did this, I would be honest, before I even learned what culturally responsive teaching and education was, I hadn't even heard of that term yet when I was trying to think of ways to bring our group together. I wanted to have my domestic students experience what activity and what sport and what fitness might be from other parts of the country, or other parts of the world, excuse me. And so what I implemented was I did sort of a individual or group project where every month or two, I would surrender my classroom to one of my students or a group of students and have them come in and teach a game or an activity that they may have had when they were growing up or from their part of the world. And one thing, and I'll focus on this one thing that people in the United States do not understand a lot of is that one of the most important and impactful sports in the world is not practiced a lot in the United States, and that's cricket. And cricket is a huge sport internationally, and it's not something that is taught a lot in physical education in the United States. A lot of that may be from an equipment standpoint, but I think a lot of it is just, it's not, as kids, domestically growing up here, it's basketball, it's soccer, soccer is a great world sport in addition, but, we have a lot of those sports that we focus on, baseball and cricket. I knew absolutely nothing about cricket. I mean, I had seen it, I had seen some of the implements, but I didn't know much about it. And I could not wait for that class. I could not wait to put my clipboard down and I went and got in the back of the line with all the students. And I want to learn about this. I want to learn what we're doing. And I had three students from India, and they came in and they led this cricket unit. And it was so good that I had them do it a second day. And I wanted to do it again. And they brought in this, they had a community group. There were some of their dads and uncles who lived here were part of a neighborhood cricket organization, and they came in and they brought all the implements, they brought all the wickets, they brought all the equipment for us, and it was great. And students loved it. And it's things like that where I would not be able to teach that as well as they could. We can do our research and we can learn about a sport, we can learn about the terminology and the equipment, we can learn that stuff. But I think that, that cultural background and understanding the history and the impact on their childhood that sport had, it makes it so much more impactful that we can't achieve that. That's not something that we can bring to our class, that they were able to. I mean, I would dare say one of the better units that we had that year, and I didn't even teach it. And it takes a lot for a teacher to admit that, but it was just a great unit. And I had so much fun learning about their culture and learning about their game, and, you can see kids go through activities and they enjoy activity, but when you connect that cultural background and that, it's almost that home cooking aspect where they just see their eyes light up and they're like, oh my gosh, I cannot wait to do this with everybody. And seeing that passion that comes out in your students, it's something that sometimes teachers need to understand that we can't always do on our own, that we need that help and that melting pot to be able to provide that. So that was my experience. And that was, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on what you may maybe have done in the past. I like giving teachers real world examples, and so.
Yeah, you said it perfectly, and you and I kind of have the same experience. The last school I taught at was an international baccalaureate school. So yep. we had refugee students from Congo and Africa, from South America. So it was, like you said, melting pot, or, the new thought now is salad, right? Because each culture, each flavor, has something to bring, something new to offer, something different to offer to it all. So, but, it starts with just looking at the population that you're serving, seeing those students, and not just seeing their faces, but actually seeing them from who they are and what they bring, to the class, and what their lives may be like outside of the classroom, seeing that and, showcasing that. Because like you said, every student has, they value something different when it comes to physical activity and games and sports and dance. But even more so, say you live in this area, you teach in this area that's not racially diverse, then in that case, start thinking about the world that they're entering. As teachers, we see the world, we understand the world around us. Prepare those students for that. Expose them to different cultures and values and ideas and different games and activities and abilities, right? Expose them to that. So give them, meet them where they're at when it comes to their identity, but then also give them those experiences outside of their identity, outside of themselves.
Yeah, I love it. So another one, I only have two of these, trying more quality than quantity. The other thing I want to touch on was social emotional learning. It's a topic that I think not enough teachers have focused on as a priority in their classrooms. And I don't think that is out of they're scared to, or they don't know how to. I think a lot of it is, the time that we have as instructors in the classroom, that a lot of PE teachers traditionally, they want to focus on those physical activities, those fitness concepts. And sometimes it's hard to fit in some of that SEL learning, where we can. How do you recommend that teachers, include some of those SEL principles into their methodologies, whether it be using that crosswalk or using some of those resources out there? Do you have any, any recommendations on how teachers can still continue that physical activity, because as educators, that, you know, that is the one thing that we're always going to focus on more is, you know, we want to keep our kids active and healthy, but how can we find ways to fold in some of that social emotional learning and find time for that just emotional well-being in our instruction?
Well, you know, and like I presented here, and you just talked about, it starts with identifying it and within our instruction, because it already is in the standards. We just have to take that, and you know, we have to be intentional. We have to start being intentional and really seeing, okay, this isn't just a game where we're being physically active, but we're learning. You know, when we're talking about teamwork, about decision making, you know, they're being responsible, understanding my role on this team in this activity, but really as health and physical educators, being intentional and really defining these things in our curriculum.
Like that. And I'm also going to poke Terry here because she is one of my
Hey,
go-tos
Terry.
for anything physical education related, and more specifically, you know, any kind of mental wellness and mindfulness. And, you know, she's one of my go-tos. Terry, do you have anything to add to that about how teachers and educators and advocates, I guess, can, you know, increase that SEL awareness in education?
Well, I love what Sean said about being intentional. And I think that's the first step. We just really need to build it into our current curriculum, whether it's teaching students coping skills, if they are experiencing some type of anxiety or stress, and just being aware of what's happening in your classroom. I can tell in my classroom when students are feeling tension and anxiety, and we might take a mindful minute. It may be something as simple as that, and we do some deep breathing exercises, and we talk about those coping skills for what they're feeling. So teaching those coping skills.
Awesome. I love it. All right. I think that wraps it up for today. This video will be posted shortly thereafter, and looking forward to the next one. I got my two favorite sidekicks with me right here on the screen. We're all here in one spot, so I'm happy to, you know, see you guys here. But we'll get this posted for the general public, and we'll look forward to next time. Sean, again, thank you very much.
Always welcome.